Hello and welcome to another great episode of Beam Bites. I am your co-host today, Claude Trotter, Director of Technology for Beam Education. And our main host today is going to be Dr. Andrea B. Nelson, founder and CEO of Beam Education. And we are blessed and grateful for having Dr. David L. Willis, CEO of Cedar Crest Development, joining us as our final guest in this Black History Month. And I think it's an honor and a pleasure to have you with us today, Dr. Willis, with all the great accomplishments you've had in our community. He is the managing partner, like I said, of Cedar Crest Development. And Dr. Willis, we have your main website up. Tell us a little bit about what Cedar Crest Development does, sir.
Well, Cedar Crest Development is simply the name is to do housing. I do apartments, I do indoor sports facilities, assisted living, skilled nursing, senior apartments. That's my primary business. We do development, land development, and consulting.
Very good, sir. We see down here the several HUD projects that you've been a part of, Reflections at the Oaks in Midwest City, Oklahoma, and all that kind of stuff there. The home health care management solutions.
Yeah, that was a good one.
Do tell, do tell.
Well, home healthcare management solution. We knew back early 20s that the baby boomers were coming. We're talking about people that were born between 1964 and 1963, 1954 and 1963. And there was 12 million coming at that time. And since then, we knew that there was a need for home health care. We knew there was a need for sheltering in places for the baby boomers. So between that time period, we had that many people coming, almost 80 million total. So we had to do the housing for them at that point.
Excellent, excellent. Now, Dr. Nelson, please join in with us. Let's find out a little bit about Dr. Willis's educational background. So with you being the educator on this program today, I'm going to let you drive the questioning to Dr. Willis on that. Let's find out how he got to be to this point. I would say a super entrepreneur, doing all these projects that we're seeing, and the amount of money that your company has generated and the amount of value that you put in our communities with that money, sir.
So Dr. Willis, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It is a pleasure and an honor, and we want to dig into some of your background in education, as well as what made you move from where you went to where you are now, because we know that are you a baby boomer, or are you?
Yes, I am. I was born in 1954.
Okay, so with that, we know that education and how you could get education back in the 50s and 60s were so totally different than what we do right now. And so if you could give us a little background knowledge of where you started school and all of the circumstances and situations around that, because one thing that we're leaving with the Beam Bites for this month is the fact that our children will have an oral history of what some individuals did to receive an education, when we know for a fact education was not equal, and that in many cases the doors weren't open to us in a lot of different ways for us to be educated at the highest level that some of our white counterparts were educated. So if you could, we'll give you the floor, and we want to hear more about that.
Well, thank you, Dr. Nelson. Well, basically, I was born in a little town called Hamlin, Texas. I'm number 5 of 12 children. My father had a second grade education, and my mother went to the 5th grade. And so it's hard to believe it, but I was never told to do my homework. And my father wanted me to work in the fields because he did cotton and wheat and hay and We had pigs and cows and chicken. That old term yard bird, we wanted to eat. We just went out there and ran the chicken down. But, I was deemed when I went to school at the age of 6. I was held back my first year because I really was totally illiterate. And I was put in special education. And when I got into special education, they didn't care from back in those times. Hey, they just move you on up or move you on up and to get you out of the system. So I was determined through athletics when I realized that there was being number 5 of 12 children, there was a need for one of us at least to break out. And I got a full scholarship to a little school called West Texas State University in Canyon, Texas, on a full football and track scholarship. That was my way out. When I left home, I left to a single mother. There was 7 of us, 8 of us actually, in a two bedroom project, government housing at that time. And I got to experience a whole lot of government subsidies back then as well. But when I got to West Texas State University, which is now West Texas A&M, I knew at that time I could not go back home. I knew at that time that my mother, who was on welfare, and there's a brief story on that. When she told me when she went on welfare, she put us kids around her and she said, if people want to put me on this subsidies, I'll take the food, but I don't want to do the welfare. And she said, as soon as you boys, and I got enough of y'all in there working, get to the point, I'm going to call those people and tell them, don't send me no more checks. So when I went to West Texas State University, I was already a father. I had an 8-month-old daughter. I had a full scholarship, and I didn't have a choice. I had to make it. So in football, what I did with the football was basically this. I hit harder. I ran faster. I knew that education was going to be my way out. And that's pretty tough. When I didn't have a plan B. I had plan A. That was to get a degree. In my second year of college, there was a group of men that approached me to a fraternity called Alpha Phi Alpha. I saw that they stressed scholarship, punctuality, neatness, accelerating in your curriculum. They demanded that we maintain at least a 3-point grade average. And I did. From that, I excelled in football because I didn't have like I said, I didn't have a plan B. My sophomore year, I was asked to come out by the track coach to start competing. I did that after my sophomore year. And from that, I qualified for the Olympic trials in the track, in the hurdles, 110-meter hurdles, in the hurdles, which was great. And I qualified for the Olympic trials. That year they were in Canada in 110 meters. So from that, I just decided to look, hey, you got to get this paper while you're here. A lot of people thought, why not pro football? After my junior year, I realized a lot of my friends that I considered to be better football players than me were coming back. And they didn't get their degree. So I decided at that point, academics, again, was going to be the way out. So I became a member of Alpha Phi Alpha. I started the chapter there at the West Texas State University. I actually pledged at Texas Tech University, and they put us on a charter line. So I did that for 2 years. When I graduated, I became a graduate assistant. My first degree was in physical education. A lot of people think physical education is an easy, but it's not. Because in physical education, you got to know physiology, you got to know biology, you got to know kinesiology, you got to know test and measurements. All of that roll up into that academic. So I spent 1 year as an assistant coach in football as a graduate assistant. And then the next year, I went into public schools in Hereford, Texas, at a junior high school, which, and if you never taught in junior high, that's an experience within itself. Woo! They're going through puberty and they don't really know who they are at that point. But I got to teach world history and Texas history to those kids, and that was a highlight. But I only spent 1 year in public schools, and well, right doing that, when I was in public schools, I was working on my master's degree in education as well. I went back to the university in 1981 as an assistant track coach, and I was only 25 years old at the time, and that was a Division I school. And from that, 1 year as the assistant living, as assistant track coach, the guy retired from the track and field, and the athletic director came up to me and asked me, did I want to be the head coach, or would I accept that position? I was 26 years old at the time. I was the youngest Division I coach in America at that time at 26. So God's been good.
I'm sure he's been very good. You know, I was listening to what you were talking about, and the thing that resonated within me as I was listening to you give us your background on everything that has happened and occurred in your life. As you said, your steps were ordered. But what kept coming out to me was I heard about resilience. I heard about grit. I heard about discipline. And so many of our young people today don't understand that when you get behind the 8 ball, you have to have that resilience. You have to have that grit, and you have to have the discipline. So if you could talk a little about having to come in those different positions and situations where the resilience and grit had to be there, we could further that discussion for the young folk that might be listening this evening.
Well, I appreciate that. That's a good question because you had to have the grits. And I never left myself a plan B. When you go in there at 26 years old and you're the head of the department at a Division I school, you got to understand, to put it in perspective. I compete against USC, UCLA, Auburn, Clemson, Georgia, Oklahoma State, University of Houston, Texas University. And I would walk in because I only had stopped running track, a couple of years prior to getting that job. And I would walk in and look at me as the kid. Well, I'm 6'4". At that time, I was weighing 220 pounds. And not to bring the racial issue into it, but I have to. They look at me as this kid, how did you get here? What do you know about track and field? One of the things that I did, I went out to cities like St. Louis, Denver, Chicago, and I recruited those kids out of schools like Phillips High School, who I knew. I sat down with their mothers. And it's sort of like what Deion Sanders said. As I said to their mothers, even back in the 80s, I guarantee you, your son come with me, he's going to be a student athlete. He's going to graduate. I had 52 kids on my team, African American, white, Hispanic, African, and I had a 96% graduation rate because they knew that they had to get in the books. when you leave yourself no options. And I was a father, I was a young father, and I did get married. And I had to take care of a family. But I also knew that education was it for me. Losing for me was never an option. Not getting a degree was not an option. Being black, definitely, I was going to always be black. And so when I was the head men and women's track coach there at West Texas State, I was asked to do multi events. And I got in some of the best decathletes in the world. And I was asked to sit on the Olympic Development Committee for the 1984 Olympic Games in Los Angeles for multi events, which was an honor for me to do. So, I get emotional about that because opportunity, you got to be ready for those opportunities. You got to have the grit. You got to know, even now at 70 years old, I'm still out here working. And I'm approaching this like I really did when I was 20, 21, 22, 23, 26 years old.
So, Miss Dr. Willis, the one thing that you talked about was opportunity. And so, what would be good for our viewers to hear about is what was your mindset to make the shift from moving from being an educator to moving to becoming a entrepreneur who became a developer? Because I think a lot of times we think we go to college for one thing, but life will throw us a different ball and we find ourselves in another space and place. So let's talk a little bit about that shift that you made from education to entrepreneurship. But I'm also sure that during the course of that, you have never let that education background leave you as you move from being a developer.
Yeah, and that was an interesting transition for me. After the Olympic Games in 1984, as a track coach and being on the Olympic Development Committee, I felt at that time I had reached the pinnacle of success. I mean, how do you go further than the Olympic Games, I went in and I talked to the athletic director because leading up to the Olympics, I hosted what they call the pentathlon for the best in the world that were going to compete. They were going to compete in the pentathlon at West Texas State. I brought in a guy by the name of Bob Matthias, who was he was the head of the Olympic training facility in Colorado Springs, Colorado. I told the athletic director I brought in 2,000 kids and go back to the education den to come in and witness that event. As a preacher say, I'm going somewhere with this. After I brought that recognition, not just to the university, but around the world, I told them that I needed a raise, to keep my family safe. And they looked at me and said, Coach, you've done a great job, but that's all the money we're going to spend in that department. After bringing that much recognition to that university, I simply went back, wrote my letter of resignation, didn't have a job, but I knew I needed to go find one. They say you shouldn't quit one until you have one. Well, I didn't have one. But what I did have was a solid background in education. So I went to work in Houston, Texas for the B.E.A.M Corporation, what they call President and First Lady. worked for President First Lady. They said, this is your salary. I went from what the university was paying and I tripled my income. I was an assistant of that facility for 1 year. Then after that, they asked me to move up to run that facility. Valley Corporation had 254 locations throughout the United States. My facility, after 1 year, was number 3. So in the country, there again, if you're going to do a job, I didn't want just a paycheck, but I did my job. Then from that, 54 locations, I got a call from the president of Valley Corporation, said to me, you did a great job, you're number 3 in the country, but guess what? He said, David, there was a guy who used to work for us. He's coming back to the company. He's been gone for 3 or 4 years. I need you to bring him up on new techniques that you're using in your facility. And then he said the magic word. He's going to be your boss. You need to train him.
Wow.
You know what I said to them? Okay, y'all know where I live. You know where my address is. Send me my check. I gave them the keys. I figured if I'm number 3 out of 254 locations, what kind of knowledge do my competitors like to have from me? At that point in my life, I became a consultant, and I said, never again would anybody get to dictate how high I'm going to go. Last time I had a job for another corporation.
So, Dr. Willis, another word comes to me this evening, and that word is faith. So what I just heard you talk about is moving in a place of faith the size of a mustard seed. And so as I think about what you did when you left the university and you moved to work at B.E.A.M, you had to make some decisions, but you also had to have an internal strength to push you to the next place. Because the one thing that we're going to talk about also is the company that I own, which is called B.E.A.M Education. And so B.E.A.M specifically looks at providing 21st century support to school districts. We are looking at opening up a micro school in August 2025. And we're also looking at providing support and services to both communities, to school districts, and businesses. But a lot of times what people don't tell you about entrepreneurship, because I'm like you, I was in education, love getting that little check every month. As a female, loved getting that check. But there was a higher calling for me, because as I started really looking at what was being given to children who looked like me, it concerned me a whole lot. And so with B.E.A.M Education, the E in B.E.A.M stands for 2 different things. When we're talking about the company, B.E.A.M stands for Building Excellence Academically and Mindfully. But when we talk about the school that we're working to open in August 2025, the E stands for entrepreneurship. And that is another reason why we're having this discussion with you tonight, because B.E.A.M stands for, when I think about B.E.A.M Micro School Academy, what we're saying is that this school is dedicated to building entrepreneurs academically and mindfully. So I am also currently in a faith walk, but I haven't been walking in a faith walk as long as you have in down the path of entrepreneurship. So I want you to help us all understand why those skill sets, that determination, that resilience, that grit, that walking in places where you can't even see what's going on, but you're still walking that path. Let's talk a little bit about why entrepreneurship was the way that you went and what skill set you had to have, because you had a lot of those skills, but you didn't know you were getting ready to take it to the next place. And why is this so important for today's children to have that same skill set?
Mm-hmm. Well, I appreciate that. Well, being 26, thrown into what I consider a management position, I had a budget there at the university. I had to manage that budget. I had to manage 52 kids. I had to put that school on the map. So strategically, you get, you think strategically, what is my next move? And how do I manage this budget, get the maximum effect out of this budget and move this program to the next level? So I did that. And unfortunately for the university, they didn't want to pay me for that. The same thing happened with the Valley Corporation. I went in, I looked at their systems, and I knew where they were weak at as far as bringing in new members to the Valley Corporation, or the president and the first lady. And I implemented systems, management system, then the same thing, to take them to the next level through marketing, advertising. And I brought in people that were hungry. What I mean by that is, one thing to bring in salespeople, and I didn't want a bunch of order takers. I wanted people that would come in and work with the client and show them a better path in their health and how to manage their health, and from nutrition all the way down. So I had people lining up to come in there. And when I left, I took those same skills into my own business. A company came to me that owned 3 or 4 banks. They had a health facility that was failing in Arlington, Texas. They said to me, "Can you come in and turn this around?" Of course I can. I left Houston and moved to Arlington. I had a very good contract, by the way, by that time, because I didn't let people tell me what I was worth. I put a price tag on me that I knew my worth. Take this company from, let's say, 50,000 a week to 100,000 a week. They need to pay for that skill. And they need to pay for that skill set. So I would say to the young people, know your worth.
So, Dr. Willis, what helped you find and know your worth? I mean, what was it in your family, in your educational background, in your spiritual background, that helped you center and focus and find and demand your worth and stand up for your worth? Because so many people don't have anything to stand up for, it seems like, or don't show any reason to stand up for something.
Well, being hard, I had to go back again. That opportunity at 26 years old. But I also had to go back to my father, who was a dirt farmer. We got up at 4 a.m. in the morning. The worst thing that John Deere did to tractors was put lights on them. I was in the field, believe me. And he was a hard worker. My mother, she worked hard. One of the stories I remember, we didn't have a car, but she would walk us to school. Then she bought a car that looked like an airplane. It was ugly. And we would ask her to, drop us off a week, 2 or 3 blocks before we got to school, because the kids would laugh at us. So, iron sharpens iron. Simple as that.
So tell us about what was your elementary school experience? I'm assuming this was a time when the schools were segregated and smaller schools, and maybe not the best resources. Tell us about that experience and how that
Well,
started out for you.
well, I realized, when I was deemed special education, I don't tell this story much, but I wanted to be in special education because they didn't have to do that much. And I took a math test and I aced it. Then they realized I've been faking it. I was more educated. I was smarter than what I was putting on. And I remember when I've gotten into high school and my athleticism was good, and the coaches came up to me and said, your GPA is at a 1.5. No school going to take you unless you get a 2.5 or better if you want to get into a D1 school. The next time they put out the grades, I was on the B.E.A.M roll. I had been faking it just to stay with my friends. In the elementary, we did a play. I never forget the play. And our teacher said, y'all don't have to learn any lines to this play. I'm gonna be a narrator. Y'all need to act out what I say. Yeah, right. So I kind of skated through, mid school, mid elementary. I skated through junior high. I went to work when I was in high school to go to college. So my experience was, if you go, you need to show your talents immediately. Don't fake it like I did.
Now, Dr. Nelson, as a principal in the school system, talk to us about how you've seen so many of the Black and brown kids get put in that special education, and how it's supposed to only be a temporary in a way in which to get them some remedial help and then get them back into the mainstream of things, and kind of how that's turned into some of the school to prison pipeline predictions and numbers that we're trying to break.
What I think you have to think about is the circumstances and situations that we currently find ourselves in. If you look at percentage wise, the children who are sitting in special ed, they tend to look like us. And there are a lot of reasons why that happens. A lot of times, one thing that we have to realize that currently in education, because African Americans have more opportunities than they did back in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. So therefore, 80% of the population who teaches are white, are Caucasian. And so because of that, they don't understand the background of the children. They don't understand that many times culturally, we don't want to stand out as smart. And so therefore, spend a lot of time faking and shaking, just like Dr. Willis talked about, because we don't want our friends to see us that way. And so therefore, when you start looking at all of the statistics, it might be discipline. It might be, we had Miss Shepherd on last week, and she was saying they tried to put her in special ed because she was quiet. And then when they tested her, what they discovered was the fact that she was GT. And so a lot of it revolves around the expectations that were set for what African Americans could do mentally, because in those days, and even right now, a lot of times we don't think that we can excel at the highest levels that our white counterparts can excel. And so, therefore, it becomes real important that when we think about special ed is just like any other strategy or any other program that I have that should support ensuring that students get what they need, because that's why they call what is called is a ARD. And so the ARD is an acronym for admissions, review, and dismissal. But so many of our children, once they are in the special ed pipeline, they end up staying because the strategies that support them moving out, the way that we support children in learning so that they become their own learner-centered individual who knows how best they learn, we don't do those things with them. And then we tend to dummy the work down so they never are able to catch up with their counterparts. So the special ed phenomenon has many different factors that hinder kids from getting out of special ed, and also put children in that special ed pipeline.
I got up on the screen some of the statistics that are up there. It's terrible. About 1 in 4 Black children with disabilities were suspended at least once versus 1 in 11 white students with disabilities. Talking about the punishment policies and even what they quote are the best practices. My question to both of you guys is, what can we do, or how can we do education differently so that we can speak to these needs that our students have? Because in some cases, it's them getting bored because they're not being taught enough or challenged enough. In other cases, like you said, like what you went through, Dr. Willis, you just wanted to hang out with your friends, and the peer pressure of not being smart was placed upon you, and so you dummied yourself down to fit hanging out with your friends, right? To fit in. So how?
Well, first of all, I think that it's really important that we start at the beginning. You know, I'm going to put this out here. It might be a little controversial, but I'm still going to put it out here. A lot of individuals who say they're pro-life, I don't agree with them that they're pro-life. Because if you were truly pro-life, it's not just about a baby that's inside a mother's womb. Because life happens after you get outside of the womb. And so, therefore, when you do not have strong educational programs for both the mother and for children, with good, solid daycare that supports children having those prerequisite skills to learn how to read, to learn how to do math, to be good speakers, all start at the home, and it starts after you get out of the womb. But if we're not doing those things, and we have children who come to school, just a statistic, because I would love for you to bring up Jawanza Kunjufu and what he talks about when he talks about boys, and specifically what happens when African American children enter the institution called school. And when they enter that institution, we are usually seen as ahead of the ball. But the minute we come into that institution we call as school, what happens to our children is, because we don't come from the same structure that many middle-class families have, that our experiences are different, that is where we start to fall behind, because we have not really embraced who these children are, as well as the experiences that they have, and really looking at some of the challenges that they have when they get to our doors to come into school. And so, therefore, we must rethink what we're doing at school that ensures that all children have the opportunity to be successful, and not just look at the fact that the color of their skin, if they're low socioeconomics, but put those strategies in place that ensure that all students have the opportunity for success. But it's done in a personalized, customized way that fits the need of that particular student.
Yeah, Dr. Nelson, if I can interject on that.
Go right ahead, Dr. Willis.
With me taking the step to go to college, my daughter now is a therapist. My granddaughter went to Texas A&M and graduated in 3.5 years in health science. She's just 2 years, she's in her second year of her doctoral program at Texas Tech School of Pharmacy right now. She'll be graduating out of that program in 2027. So you're absolutely right. What you teach them, what you expose them to. I told my granddaughter when she was a little baby that she was going to be great. When I started my own business, she would come to see me in spring break, and I'll set her in a corner and say, watch what your grandfather's doing. I gave her books like Think and Go Rich. I gave her a book called The Millionaire Mindset because I knew that this child needed to go out there and excel. So you're right. There are so many barriers, economics, social economics, all of that does play into it. But we got to look at those parents and make sure we get that parent involved in their education.
Speaking of which, let me ask both of you all, what was the educational level of your parents? Because I know I was blessed to have parents where I'm the third generation of a college student. And I believe Dr. Nelson probably second or third as well. So we all saw from early on our expectations that we were going to college. So let's talk to a little bit about that family involvement, that parent involvement on setting the standards high and giving us the tools to be successful in reaching those standards.
Well, for me, like I said earlier when I started out, my father went to the 2nd grade. My mother went to the 5th grade. I was never told to do my homework. That was not a priority. You know, my expectation growing up was my dad was a farmer, you be a farmer. You know, it was through athletics. And I thank them both for that. You know, the athletics was my way out. But I knew that once I got there, in order to stay there, I couldn't call home. There was no bankroll at the house. I knew when I left, I had $50 in my pocket. But I went to a school that understood that they just gave me a full scholarship. They realized that I was married and I had a child. And I knew that too. So knowing that, you know, there was no, like I said, there was no plan B. Plan A was education for me. And I don't give myself plan Bs now.
Dr. Nelson, when you speak to your family experience and how they got you to being a doctor and some of the challenges you faced on your road to being a doctor.
Well, I am 4th generation college grad. So the expectation, and I think a lot of times when we're working with low socioeconomic students, we start too late. You know, it wasn't anything for me to go to Howard University because I grew up in Washington, D.C. in the suburbs of Tacoma Park, Maryland. But it wasn't anything for me to be walking around on a college campus in my elementary years because that was the expectation that was set. Anytime there was something going on at Howard, my mother had my brother and I there, you know, and making sure that we were seeing what was going on at a college campus. You know, for me, those first years of my life, I thought college was a social thing. You know, I get to go in 4th grade with a cousin who was going to Howard, and my mother said, "Can you let her go and see what it's like to go in the dormitory?" So I had many opportunities to see the other side of college life, which is enticing to a little, 10-year older high school kid, of being able to walk around a college campus knowing one that was specifically designed for me and mine as an African American. And I think that was the biggest legacy that my family could have given us, was to make us strong in who we were as African American. Because my grandmother was an English teacher. I spent the summers with her, and she had us reading all of the classics. Moby Dick, all of those books were something, because she wanted us to be able to compete with the children that we were coming up against, because we were the children in the first part of integration, where now, because of Brown versus Board of Education, we are now sitting in classes with children who do not have the same skin color that we have. And so through all of those experiences, by the time I went to high school, I made the decision that I wanted to go to a historically Black university. My mother, my grandmother, all my aunts had gone to Fayetteville State in North Carolina and went to historically Black university. And so that was the path that we've traveled in our family, was that we were able to first get the first undergraduate degree in a historically Black university. My brother went to Howard. He spent so much time at Howard, he ended up, my father was a Howard grad, and my uncles were Howard grads. So he decided to go to Howard, but we saw dreams that our parents dreamed and our grandparents dreamed, such high dreams for us, that my brother went on to get a MBA from Harvard. I ended up getting a doctorate from Mary Hardin Baylor. I currently have a cousin who is working on a degree, a doctoral degree in AI from Columbia University. And that backstory about her is they didn't want to even admit her in the program because they felt like she didn't have the advanced math background. But what she explained to them, because she had to do an interview with them, was the fact that even though she went to a historically Black university, she went to the top 2 historically Black universities that pull out math and engineers when they graduate, which is Prairie and A&T in Greensboro, North Carolina. And so she said, from there, I went on and got my master's from Johns Hopkins in data analytics. And she said, I'm very capable of doing the work. And right now she's sitting at Columbia and she is working on a doctorate in AI. And so my brother reminded me, he said, you were the first woman in the family to hold a doctorate. And right now we have 3 other individuals who, if they have not been hooded for their doctorates, they are making that path. So all of that is what we have to do to help families, because to move their children in a way so that they can be successful, because we're living in the 21st century. And what we really have to think about, although college is important, because one trip as I was working on the doctorate, we went to Europe. And so we were able to see their educational system. And the one thing that stood out for me about their educational system is everyone is important, because just like the college grad is important, the person who does your plumbing is just as important and can make $100,000 a year. And so when I started thinking and making that shift, it became important for me to realize that when I'm talking to children, I want them to dream their biggest dream, but I also want them to understand it doesn't have to be with college, but it does have to start with training. It does have to start with education of some form.
Definitely. And I think the other thing that you guys both touched upon, and I want to talk a little bit in my story on getting to the point. I didn't rise educational wise to the level of either one of you guys to having doctorate degrees, but it's a lifelong learning process. I went down the field of communications. As a child, I liked what I saw on TV, like most kids. And I found it an area of magic, all the different special effects and stuff that you could do and you saw on TV, especially back in the 70s and the 80s when we were coming up, that type of thing. And one of the things I was blessed with is that I got early exposure to Hampton University. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. I worked with my father on the weekends. My dad always told me, you work your 9 to 5 to pay the bills, and you work your side hustle, your other businesses, your family businesses to get ahead. So that family business was real estate for us. And Dr. Willis, I'm sure you can relate to that with the number of kids that you had in your family. Families took advantage of the free labor that they had. That's one of the reasons why they had so many kids, so that you could work that family business. So not only was I working with my dad on the weekends and that time, it motivated me because he wasn't paying me, at least not cash. He was paying me for the roof over my head. It motivated me to get a paper route so that I could start getting some money that I had and I could spend the way I wanted. And for those of you guys out there, I want you to look up the Cleveland Plain Dealer and the Blizzard of 78, because you hear a lot of time with the old folks talking about, I walked, 2 miles in snow up to my waist, up and down hill. Well, they probably lived in Cleveland or Chicago or one of those lake effect areas or states. But after we moved out of there, we moved to Hampton, Virginia. That's where both my parents graduated from college. And I tell people I rode along for the first time and then came back and got my degree and did better than both of my parents GPA wise. But they had tougher majors. My mom was a nursing student. My dad was an architect. Both of those are usually 5-year programs. But I was able to come in. I got lucky and got the exposure that while I was a senior in high school, I had cousins that were seniors at Hampton University. And one of those friends of one of my cousins actually worked in the department, the mass communications department, where I wanted to go to school. So after I finished up high school, I would go over to Hampton University and hang out in the studio. I was more of a studio rat than a basketball rat. At 6'5", you would have thought I would have been on the court, but being 6'5", 180 pounds and a 29-inch waist, I was like Manute Bol getting blown all over the place. So I took the path of post John, Sally, and Bad Boys, and I guess became that computer nerd working with all the technology and stuff. But it was a matter of finding out what was I interested, what motivated me to learn, and being able to work with all the tools and equipment in the broadcast community helped sharpen my skills to want to learn all the stuff that went behind the scenes. I was challenged with geometry and figuring out that in mathematics. But one of the great things that I realized when I was in broadcast is we had a tool called the kaleidoscope, which was the embodiment of what geometry was, because it wound up doing all the calculations, all the things where you see video flying in and out the screen. That's geometry in motion. And those calculations were some of the things that you learn in geometry and how that is put into practical life skills. So Dr. Nelson, talk about what the goal is with B.E.A.M to be able to link practical life skills with the education basics that a lot of times we get bored with that we're being taught in school.
So, just to give you my elevator speech on B.E.A.M Micro School Academy, it is a school that we've done away with the arbitrary use of grades, meaning that every student that enrolls in B.E.A.M Micro School Academy will have a scholar inventory done on them, specifically looking at what they're good at in academics, what they need help on in academics, looking at their interest on what they like to learn and know about, talking to family so that we understand their cultural experience at home. How does the extended family support what goes on in education, as well as how do they celebrate being family? Then we take all of that information from how they learn, their interests. Are they auditory learners? Are they visual learners? Are they kinesthetic learners where they have to move? And then we move towards taking that information with parents, because we do interviews with parents, and coming up with something called a personalized educational portfolio. And in that portfolio, that becomes the roadmap on what we're going to do to support the children. Because for so long, we have just put kids. I was 5 when I went to first grade. How did you even know in first grade that at 5 years old, I could do what it was that you wanted me to do? You didn't do any tests on me to see that. Just so happened I had a mother and a grandmother that was pushing reading left and right. So that's one of the things that we're going to do. Then we have something called the PEP, the Probe Prep Push program session. And one thing I didn't tell you about the school is, because it's a 21st century school, there are 2 arrival times and 2 dismissal times. Who said that everyone has to come to school at 8 o'clock or 8:30 in the morning? Because you really got to think about how children learn and what their parents need. We're in the 21st century. And we're not doing that. And so the goal for us is to make sure that children come in at 8 o'clock. If they come in at 8, they leave at 3. If they come in at 10, they leave at 5. But in that 8 o'clock time from 8 to 10, that is when we do the PQ, which is probe, prepare, and prop. And I can't even remember it. I said it before. But during that period, that 2-hour session, the goal is, number one, once we find out what you're strong at and what we find out what you need help on, that's when we do it. So we give you intervention, we give you acceleration on what you're good at, and we coach and conference you. Because one of the biggest ways to move children is by giving them very explicit feedback and teaching them how to set goals that move them to the next level. And so that won't be done. When I was a principal in Dallas, I had to do that every other week with children. So we had an A group and a B group. But the children who come to B.E.A.M Micro School Academy, they will have the opportunity to speak with a facilitator, which we call teachers now. But the facilitator them to tell them this is what you're doing well in your personalized education portfolio, as well as let's conference. Let's talk about how we're going to get there with the goal that you set. Then we move on to at 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock. The 10 o'clock kids come in. And I know you're wondering what happens to them. Do they also get the same session? Yes, but they get it when the 3 o'clock students leave. So their time is from 3 to 5. They get the same identical thing: intervention, acceleration, front loading, and exposure to brand new skills, as well as conferencing and coaching. Now, from Monday through Thursday, everything that we work on will be done in project-based learning based on real life circumstances and situations. I would go into those, but I don't want to spend that long on my elevator conversation. So what I will tell you is that during that information, when they are learning in project-based learning, they're taking their reading, their math, their science, their social studies, all of that skill set, and they're using it on project-based learning. One of the lessons that we talk about and show parents is called the Innovator. And so kids are really looking at, in that particular unit, they're looking at climate change issues. And they're coming up with finding out the problems with climate change, as well as coming up with solutions about the project, about climate change. And then they have to come up with a whole business plan around their product, as well as if it's a product or service that they're going to offer. And we could go into more. I would suggest that people join us on Thursday nights, Thursday night for February and March, so that you can hear more about the innovators, the eco innovators. So Monday through Thursday, that's what we're doing. On Friday, we have Lab Day, and Lab stands for learning, building, learning, attitude, and building. Sorry, I said that wrong. Learning, achieving, and building. So with that learning, building, achievement, now kids are taking real courses. They're taking courses in environmental stewardship. They're taking courses in mass communication. They're taking courses in digital technology and ethics, because that becomes important. When you look at what some of the technology bigwigs are doing, they're not thinking about the ethical side of the technology that they're producing. And so we have to have a group of individuals, the next generation, that understands that although technology helps us, it also can be a hindrance, or it can be a thing that causes great sorrow for human beings. So then we're doing digital technology. They're taking a course in mass communication, and they're also taking a course in design. Think about how all of those courses that I just talked about lead to them being good speakers, lead to them becoming leaders of their communities, because what we're doing right now does not truly support the 21st century adult that will be inheriting the society that we're in currently. And so that, in a nutshell, is what B.E.A.M Micro School Academy will do for the children who become the scholars of our building.
Well, Dr. Willis, we're just a little bit over an hour, and we want to be respectful of your time. What closing remarks or words do you have for our viewers that joined us today, sir?
Well, my closing words goes as the pastor by the name of Pastor E.K. Bailey. He was at Concord Missionary Baptist Church when I was going there. And it was very profound when he said that one of the parishioners came to him and said that he had just bought a brand new Cadillac, red, and that he came into a storm, hailstorm. And he said he saw the storm coming, but he was in his new car. So as he got closer to the weather, the hailstorm started to beat his car up. He said he got so frustrated that he stopped in the middle of the hailstorm. And his car, his windows, the paint, everything got beat off of it. And Pastor Bailey said what he said to him was basically this: do you realize that a storm is not going to last long? He said, when you hit that storm, if you would have just kept driving, you would have kept on driving, your car would have had less damage on it. He said, but you decided in your infinite wisdom to stop your car and get the hell beat out of you when you could have just kept moving. And so what I say to you out there, you're going to have storms. You're going to have trials and tribulations. You're going to face a lot of setbacks, but that don't mean that you have to stop. You just keep going. And that's been my philosophy, to keep going in the middle of the storm, because they don't last forever.
All right, Dr. Nelson, any closing words as we finish out today?
I couldn't have been as eloquent as Dr. Willis was. I think he's shown us through his story and through the steps that he has taken through life that life is a journey, but he had the tools. The scripture, especially the book of Ephesians, talk about putting on the full armor of God. And so as we put on the full armor of God, we are better able to fight what life will give us. So I want to end with this final word, because it was obvious that Dr. Willis has battled, but he wasn't a victim, he was a conqueror. And so these are the final words of Nelson Mandela. Education is the most powerful weapon which we can use to change the world. So it was obvious that even in the situation that Dr. Willis, he used the power of education to fight against racism, to fight against not having, and he ended up being the victor. And so that is the same thing that we want for the families that we serve and that we help in the community that we live in called the Dallas Metroplex area.
And with that, I'm going to go ahead and close out. I'm going to invite all of our viewers to go to beameducation.org. Go down to the bottom of the first page. Register, join us. Please leave us a tax-deductible donation so that we together as a community and a family, we can work to make a difference while we make a living. Thank you guys all for joining us today. And with that, we're going to go ahead and close out. Thank you again, Dr. Willis, for joining us. Everybody have a great evening. Thank you.